think about leading with love. It's been proven to get results. We all know that love is the energy of life. It's one of the most important things out there. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why wouldn't we lead that way?
If something clearly works, shouldn't we at least be willing to give it a try? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from veteran CEO Joel Manby. For over 25 years, Joel held senior leadership positions in both publicly traded and privately held organizations, including General Motors' Saab and Saturn divisions, and entertainment companies that house brands such as Dollywood, the Harlem Globetrotters, and SeaWorld. But achievement as a CEO was not the end of Joel's career or influence. He still had gas in the tank and a personal mission to fulfill. So he became an author and speaker. Joel's book, Love Works, has sold over 100,000 copies globally. And if you winced just a bit when you heard that book title, Love Works, you are exactly the person who needs to hear what Joel shared with us. During our discussion, he takes us beyond the English language to explain more accurately what he means when he uses the word love. He brings data into the conversation to talk about the perceived conflict between being a leader who cares deeply for followers and being a leader who produces results. But first, we start by hearing about Joel's leadership in the automotive industry and how serving on the board of a privately held company at the age of 40 resulted in meeting the mentor who would completely change the trajectory of Joel's leadership.
My career spans 45 years, so I'm almost 65 now, which is really hard to believe. But it really bifurcates into two different professional experiences. The first 20 years, I was in the auto industry. So I helped start up Saturn Corporation back in the day and ran a large division for General Motors, Saab, which is a European car. Mm-hmm. And I loved my time there. I had great experiences, but I think I learned more about how not to lead than how to lead. The auto industry was very fear-based. It was very autocratic. It was filled with a lot of temper and anger. And if you didn't hit your numbers, you were gone. And it just didn't have a culture focus. Now, this was years ago. I'm sure things have changed. And I had some mentors along the way, but I would say my life really changed as a leader when I was about 40 years old. So even though I had run two different companies in the industry, I actually also did an Amazon startup where we sold cars on Amazon. Jeff Bezos was on our board. I mean, that's a whole different podcast to talk about my experience with Bezos. And he's a very bright guy, really enjoyed the experience. But what happened is I was asked to be on the board of this theme park company while I was running Saab. And I was exposed to this kind of culture that I had never seen before, the focus on people, the loving nature of the owners. And it was like a light bulb came on for me, Tim. I had an angst in my soul for that first 20 years. I literally did. I had grown up with a faith, a Christian faith. I believed that I was supposed to love other people, and Jesus taught me to do that. And yet I didn't see that anywhere in the automotive world. And so I always had this angst that there had to be a better way. When I saw this theme park company, it's called Hershend Enterprises, and Jack Hershend was my mentor. He taught me really leading with love, which is what we're going to talk about in the rest of our time together. And he didn't have the vernacular defined. He just was. It was who he was, which obviously fits exactly what you talk about. But what I did as the CEO coming in, because then I became CEO a few years later, and he asked me to join the company, I learned, I really created the vernacular of what he was, and then taught that to not only Silver Dollar City, where he was, but all their other properties throughout the rest of the country. So he was the influential mentor who taught me leading with love. And then I put a vernacular to it and taught it to all the other parks in their system. And we had huge turnarounds in performance because of leading with love. So he is really the man that taught me how to lead with love.
What's so amazing about your story to me is the note you made about this happened for me at the age of 40. I think that there's such a temptation as we look at other leaders that we would consider successful and look at all the things they've done. And we have this notion that they just kind of came out of the womb, this unbelievably developed and thoughtful leader. And yet so often I hear stories from leaders where they had a huge developmental moment or developmental experience, developmental relationship that happened not even in early stages in life. I
Right.
mean, so much we are influenced by early things in life, but I get a chance, the privilege to hear so many stories. And it's not that those who wouldn't, there are some people that would come to the story and say, here's what I was taught from the age of 8 on, and that's what I apply today. And so I'm not saying that those stories aren't great, but I think there's an element to your story that says it's almost like there's a validating aspect to the fact that it didn't happen to you until later on. It wasn't just assumed from, early ages, and you had a very conscious learning experience that happened later in life.
I think that's a really powerful point, Tim. And I know you have listeners out there who are resonating with this because so many people desire better leadership than they're experiencing, and they're in their early 20s. It's their first, second, third job, or maybe early 30s, and they're just thinking, man, business has to be better than this, or leadership has to be better than this. And I do think overall it's getting better in our country, not worse. But I do agree with you. It's a blessing if you get it early. And I was certainly taught to love by my parents, but I could not make that transfer into the work world. I just didn't know how. And I'd love to get into that if we have time, because I think most people misunderstand what love really is. And so they can't transfer that thought into the workplace. But that's what Jack Hershon did for me, is he taught me to transfer it into work, which was great.
That is great. So that provides us a great segue into this scary word. Oh my goodness, we're talking about business, we're talking about performance, we're talking about results, we're talking about money, and somebody keeps saying this 4-letter word.
Right.
That, wait a second, should we really be talking about the idea of love when performance is so on the line? So help us understand, what do we really even mean by this word in the context that we're talking about it?
What is love? I think it's really, really important. For me, spiritually, it is the number one commandment of Jesus. So I try to follow him. So for me, it's a personal thing. But I would say for all your followers and listeners, that's not their gig. It's still what drives humanity. It is the most powerful force on earth. Everybody agrees with that. Every major religion focuses on it. Even secularists focus on it. It's the energy of life, and it's what transforms people is love. But
what percentage of songs are about love? I don't know the answer, but it's way up there.
It always transforms relationships. But there's more than one kind of love, and that's the problem. Is in the English language, we only have one word for love that encapsulates many different feelings and types of love. The Greek language, actually, which I go into in my book, has 4 different words for the same love that we try to encapsulate. So, for instance, eros is a Greek word that's where erotic comes from. And that's the kind of love that we think of when we say love. It's emotional. So often, it's our significant other, or maybe someone who we care deeply about. That's emotion. And then there's philos, which is brotherly love. That's like the city of Philadelphia is named after that. And that's that person you like to hang with. Or the third word is storge. That's parental love, how you love your child, which is very different than other kinds of love.
Yeah.
4th word is agape. That's a verb. It's not a feeling. And your listeners, that's the big takeaway, is leading with agape love is how you treat people, and it's who you are. And just as you say, Tim, in all your book and your podcast, who we are is really what makes the difference in leadership. And this is the kind of love of how you treat and behave towards other people, regardless of how you feel about them. And so at Hershon, we actually went to 1 Corinthians 13 and we paraphrased the famous love verse by Paul, who he wrote it in Greek, and he called love agape. And he defined it. We paraphrased it into 7 words, which were: love is patient, it's kind, It's truthful, trusting, forgiving, dedicated, and unselfish. And we focus all of our leadership training on those 7 words because we cared more about who they were as leaders, and we knew people would follow them if they would actually love other people. So when you ask me what is love, it's not a short answer. It's we have to understand it's a verb, and it's how we treat people. And then those 7 words became the ethos of what we call our be goals. What kind of leader do you want to be? Whereas, as you say in your book, most people focus on what leaders do. And certainly
Mhm.
we have to have do goals. We have to hit profit, we have to hit margin, we have to hit growth, we have to hit cash flow. But we also want to hit our B goals, which for us at Hershend and at SeaWorld, where I went later, it was 7 words of love.
I love. I guess I can't not use that word here. Sorry for the pun there, but yes, I love how you're unpacking that because I do. It is so critical that we be in the conversation about becoming. What does it mean to become someone? Because our research shows that 77% of leadership is a function of who you are, not
Right.
what you do. And so that means that 3/4 of our investment of time, money, and energy needs to be in the space of helping people become. And I love that you're so explicit about doing that. Now, lest anybody think, and you mentioned performance, we're going to get into that in just a second, lest anybody think this is an anti performance conversation and we're just going to hold hands and hug each other and sing kumbaya and not worry about the results. Let me just say, this is not an anti what leaders do discussion. The thing that the analogy that we use is that of a tree, and you've got the roots, then you've got the part of the tree that you can actually see. And so imagine how influential the roots are to the health, vibrancy, and quality of that tree. So the what of leadership, what leaders do that we all talk about so much around strategy and motivation, the development talent, all of those things are deeply influenced by who the leader is. So it's not that the what of leadership doesn't matter, it's that it is deeply influenced, more so than we have probably talked about over the course of history. It is significantly more influenced by who we are. Therefore, we've got to work on who we are, not because what doesn't matter, but because it's going to be affected by who we are.
It's such an important point. It is definitely both and, but
Yeah.
everybody focuses on the what. Everybody has do goals in business. So I
Yeah.
agree with you. We're not talking about the exclusion. It's just of the what. That has to happen. But we're talking about and the who. And for me it's loving others. Some other businesses may have different approaches there. I agree with you 100%. It is definitely both and just to reaffirm, 2 of my CEO gigs were public companies, 2 of them were private, but I had to hit the numbers every quarter or my job was at risk. I mean, I had to perform or I
Yep.
wouldn't be there. So it definitely, the good news is it does hit the numbers.
Yeah. Who supercharges what? If
Yes.
we are going to be like super simple about it.
Yeah,
So,
I like that.
but speaking of what and getting into performance, let's talk a little bit about that, kind of dive into that a little bit as we think about this idea of being a leader who loves, and yet what about performance? How does all this work together?
It's a huge, huge question, and it's very important to have a good answer. I will start though with most people come to work every day because they want to be inspired. They want to contribute something greater to the world. The great thing about leading with love, and I go into this a lot in the book, is we can come to work every day, and our existence as a leader is to try to love other people according to agape love. And that gives people purpose and meaning. Even if they're building widgets or they're building glue in a glue factory, they can still have huge impact on other people's lives just by the way they treat them. So I'll start with that. Most people don't go to work for the results, but they have to hit the results. So now to the meat of your question, there's a really robust Gallup survey that was done of 238 different industries, 44 different countries. It involved 1,000,008 employees. And I think it was about 1,000 different companies. It was just massive. And the bottom line is they tracked engagement scores of all these different companies, and leading with love type behavior, drove the highest engagement scores. In fact, loyalty of the customer went up 100. This is crazy, 106%. The cost of performing was like 46% less, the cost structure. But I could go into all the data, but the most important one is profitability was 34% higher than companies that didn't lead that way. And this is Gallup, who's so well known. And we tracked our engagement scores at Hershend to the qualities of the leader. And the leaders that led with love, and we scored them on that. We had objective ratings, had the best results of anyone in the company. And when we made we made 12 acquisitions while I was at Hershend, and at SeaWorld we had a couple turnarounds. And literally 100% of the time, when we went in to a new acquisition and we put these 7 words of love in place as a set of leadership principles over a 3-year period, and almost always took 3 years, Tim, but we saw massive turnarounds, both in engagement scores, the guest experience scores, and profitability. And it was consistent. It also was consistent that it took about 3 years. So all your listeners, they have any doubt that it works from a financial standpoint, both Gallup and both Hershend and SeaWorld results that I've been involved with personally all point to the fact that it does get results. In fact, that's one reason I think I have so much credibility to talk about it is I was in the auto industry where we didn't lead with love. And honestly, the results were not as good as in the theme park industry, my experience, where we did lead with love. And a lot of it's because of the poor culture in the auto industry. It did not innovate. People were scared, so they weren't free to do what was their greatest giftedness. So the numbers absolutely work.
And I just imagine, somebody who's listening, if we weren't starting out by telling them that we're going to talk about love, and we just gave the data that you just reeled off.
Right.
Okay, you're going to get this and this and this and this and this, and it's all incredible. It's all positive. Do you want to hear what it is? They'd be on the edge of their seats, like leaning in. What is it that creates such powerful results? And then you would say love, and they'd be like, really? Like, we're going to talk about it? And it was like, hey, it is. It's real. We would all want to know what produces that kind of result.
I think that's probably why my publisher didn't want me to call it LoveWorks, because he was afraid people would react negatively to love. Now it ended up doing really, really well, mostly word of mouth. Your point about people are out there and they're looking for a better way, and they need to hear this, that it starts with results. When our company, you remember Undercover Boss, the CBS reality
show? Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Our company was on it, and we were the first year, so no one knew what was going on. They really thought they were being filmed for training videos. Our episode followed the NCAA quarterfinals, like Duke versus Villanova. So there were 20 million people watching that playoff game, and they all stayed on to watch our program. And when it ended, there were so many emails and texts that our servers shut down at Hershend. And I still have an 8-foot length of all these notebooks with all these letters of people who send in texts and emails. And they all basically said the same thing. I'm looking for a better way, and leadership's broken in our company. How do we create this kind of culture? And it just shows the hunger that people have for better leadership, more loving leadership. And they'll go there if they know they can get results, which is what we just spent.
Yeah, it's it's so interesting to think about that type of response, because at times I've been in a room with groups of leaders, and we start to get towards this subject, and one of the comments that will come up occasionally is, hey, it's just a bridge too far. I get all the other things that we're talking about in terms of being human. Yes, I'm going to be empathic and curious and attentive and humble even. And I get all that, but this is a bridge too far. And then if I have my mind properly turned on, I just ask them a very simple question, which I think is the same answer for all of us, which is, all right, all other things being equal, given this definition of love that you're talking about, this actionable verb, if you could work for a leader who operated that way or didn't operate that way, which would you choose?
And that's exactly right, Tim. And I'll just give really quick couple examples. Like people will see kind as one of the words of love. They instantly think, well, I have to be nice all the time. No, that's not what it's saying. We can't be nice all the time. We have to hold people accountable. Sometimes we have to let people go. But what it means is to be more encouraging. And the human mind, science says, and research says, a human needs 3 times more encouragement than negative feedback to keep their confidence, to keep growing as a human being. And at Hershend, we were taught, and I taught others, to encourage 3 times more than you discourage. And when you have to admonish someone, you do it privately, not publicly. So our phrase for kindness was encourage 3 times more than you discourage, and write lots of thank you notes and encouragement notes. But also when you do admonish, you do it in private, and we taught a certain way to admonish people. So who in this world has too much encouragement or truthfulness, which is just one other example I'll give. You can't have kindness or encouragement if you don't also have truth. You have to hold people accountable. And if they're not performing, we have to have that conversation with them. And in the book, I go into ways to have truthful, difficult conversations, because you're right. People think, oh, I can't be nice. I'm going to dismiss this bridge too far, as you called it. If they really understand what the words are supposed to mean and what you're supposed to do, like you say, you'd want to work for that human. You'd want to work for that leader. And it's so obvious to me, but people get hung up on the nomenclature, the word love.
Yeah. And this idea of accountability is such an interesting one, because I think, look, leadership relationships in the workplace are not parent-child. And yet sometimes we can look to that relationship for some learnings here. And would we say that I've got 4 kids. The oldest is 13. The youngest is 6.
Wow.
My 6-year-old daughter is absolutely in charge of the house. So let me say that. But ultimately, if one of my kids is heading in a bad direction, is it loving? Is it caring? Am I a good parent if I just watch that car crash happen and don't say anything?
No.
Now, to your point, there's a way to do it that's more encouraging. There's a way to do it that gives you a better chance for engagement and result. But ultimately, keeping from my kids what they need to hear to grow up and become quality human beings who have quality relationships is not loving. It's actually quite selfish, because all I'm doing is avoiding a difficult conversation. So I'm choosing my temporary comfort over actually investing in somebody. And I think, kind of now getting out of the family space, think about that in the work environment. I think a lot of us are tempted to bypass the difficult conversation because of what I can only define as, it's subtle, but it's selfish.
Yeah.
I don't want to be in an uncomfortable conversation. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spare that person the feedback they need to hear so that they can get better. And we're going to say very little, very little, very little, very little, very little, very little. And then one day we're going to march them into the office and say, I'm sorry, you don't have a job here anymore because you've not been performing. Does that sound like a good way to lead people, to develop people? And it's not. And so being truthful is an important part of caring for people and loving them. So I love that you bring that up.
Your example of say nothing, say nothing, say nothing, and then let them go. That was the auto industry I lived in. That was the model. Whereas at Hershend or SeaWorld, anybody who was let go, it had to come all the way to me. I had to see that there was a track record of discussion, performance improvement plan. We gave the person every opportunity to succeed, and it shouldn't be a surprise. Now, maybe sometimes you have to do a big layoff because something like COVID happens. That's a whole different ballgame. But as far as performance dismissals, there has to be a track record.
Yeah. Well, you've got 7 things that you talk about in Love Works, and we've spent a little time talking about one of them here specifically with regard to truthful. But you've got another one in there that is a rarely discussed reality especially in for-profit business, with this idea of forgiving, which is really interesting to jump into that, given that we're talking about performance right now. So talk to us about this idea of how does forgiveness work into this equation of being a leader who leads with love?
Yeah, it's It's a hard one because it's not science, it's more art. And I
Okay.
can't tell your listeners when to do it and when not to do it. But I'll just tell one quick story. When I was at Hershend, one of the people we employed was let go at it's called Stone Mountain Park in Atlanta. Well, he reached out to me on Facebook and asked for another chance. And I usually don't get involved in that, but I did call the general manager and say, hey, look into this. The man who was fired, his name was Eric. And I asked the general manager to look into it. He did, and he decided himself to rehire Eric. I let him make the decision. It was his call. Well, about 6 months later, I went to the park, Stone Mountain, and Eric came up to me, and I recognized his picture from Facebook. I had not met him. And he said, Mr. Manby, thank you very much for responding to my Facebook, for giving me a second chance. And I wonder if you would come to my high school graduation. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I've never even met this guy. And he wants me to come to his high school graduation. So instantly I realized the impact of what forgiveness had on him. When I went to his high school graduation, I mean, I literally, when he told me that, my eyes welled up with tears. I couldn't believe it. And luckily that day was free. Well, at the graduation, I meet his mother, who's a single mom. He had 6 brothers and sisters.
Oh,
He was the
wow.
eldest man in the house, and he was the breadwinner. So if he had been let go and couldn't find
Wow.
another job, what would have happened? And instead, he finished out time with us. We almost got him into the Naval Academy, but he went on to serve in the military. He went to Afghanistan back safely. I still keep in touch with him. But I often think of what would have happened if we didn't forgive him there,
Mm.
and what would have happened to his family. And I can also give you stories where, like with some alcoholics that I gave second chances to, and we paid for the rehab, and it didn't work out well. And in one
Mm.
case, the person ended up dying of alcoholism. But
Mm.
when I went to his funeral and met his 2 young kids and his wife, I sure was glad, Tim, that I gave him every single chance to succeed. And so I think all of us need forgiveness ourselves. Why are we so reluctant to give it to others? And I know some listeners are saying, well, if someone violates a policy, you have to make a move, or they're consistently not hitting their numbers. Absolutely, you have to make the right move after coaching. But think about it more in terms of personal offenses against you. Someone says something in a
Yeah.
meeting that offends you, or a
There you go.
boss is hard on you. That's where we need to forgive, because all human relationships are broken, usually over a lack of forgiveness. And
Mm.
we want to maintain human relationship. We don't want to destroy them. And so forgiveness is a really important part of agape love. And all I can say is, yes, it doesn't always end like you want it. And yes, it's an art, not a science. But my encouragement to all your listeners is to do it anyway. Because if you don't forgive others for slights against you, it'll
Mm.
just poison your soul, and you won't be the kind of leader you need to be. So it's a rare word, but it's a really important word.
Well, there's a couple things there that first of all, I love where you're ending up with this, because I think, we do have the examples of people getting fired or not getting fired and policy violations, but the far more common application of this is what you're talking about, these
Right.
slight offenses, or somebody, like as you said, they said something in a meeting that didn't sit well with me, or maybe it kind of seemed like they were taking my idea, but I don't, what's the best explanation I could give for how that happened as opposed to the worst one? Like,
Right.
what does it mean? And you mentioned the word poison there. I think that's such a good word. It's hard for us around forgiveness, because usually when we're holding on to a lack of forgiveness, we have a reason. We have a justification, and we might even be right. That's the thing that's like, you might even be right. But then there's the old adage, and I don't know where it came from, but it says that a lack of forgiveness is like me drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick.
Yes.
And so there's not only the organizational and relational possibilities, I think there's also a freedom for us as leaders if we can lean into saying yes to forgiveness around those slights and challenges that come up. It's not an easy thing. It's not a one-time thing. But I really appreciate how you're talking about that and how important it is.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's an excellent example. It is like drinking poison and expecting it to kill the other person. It's
It never does.
no, I never.
It just puts us in a prison, and then we're in a tough spot, and relationally, it's going to sink us. KRW is a consulting firm based out of Minneapolis, and they did a research study that got published in HBR a number of years ago, and they actually measured forgiveness in the executive suite, which
Oh,
is
really?
fascinating that they went to do that. They measured a number of things. Forgiveness was one of them, and they found that leaders and leadership teams in the top 10 versus the bottom 10, those that made forgiveness a part of how they operated, they had a return on assets that was 4.8 times greater
Wow.
than the executives and executive teams that did not apply forgiveness. Again, there were a couple of other things that were very character based in there as well regarding responsibility and integrity and compassion. And so they were measuring these who based things, and forgiveness was one of them. And I was blown away, Joel, that somebody had the foresight and guts to get into corporate spaces and measure forgiveness. So just more data to go along with your other data.
So, Tim, when we were talking about truthfulness, the whole context was having a difficult conversation with somebody and being truthful to them before they were let go or what have you. There's a second aspect of truthfulness that's in the book, and it's really important for leaders. And it's creating an environment where truth can be told freely. The number one reason people leave organizations, according to Gallup, is they don't feel heard and they feel like they're not being listened to. I guess it's the same thing. And so you have to create an environment of truthfulness. And I learned a really powerful lesson about that actually from Dolly Parton, because we ran her parks when I was at Hershend Enterprises. And she came to a meeting one time where we were pitching to do a hotel. I was on the board. Sorry, I was on the board. I wasn't part of management. And the board turned down this pitch to put a hotel at Dollywood. And Dolly really wanted the hotel. So you think of all the ways she could have reacted in a way that might stifle truth and might not get at really what are the issues here. Yeah. But what she did taught me some very powerful principles about leadership. First of all, she didn't shoot the messenger. The second thing she did, though, that's not intuitive, is she talked last. So she went around the room and without giving her opinion, she started from the most junior person and went all the way to the chairman. And she did that purposefully because people aren't completely truthful if they've already heard what their boss says, right? So she created this safe space for them to say what they wanted. And so she listened. Then the third thing she did is she listened so that she could really understand, listen to understand, not to be understood, which is famous Stephen Covey line. But
that's right. Yep.
She definitely listened. And then the magical part, the fourth thing she did is she articulated back why she wanted to go in a different direction. She incorporated what she heard from all of us. So we knew she had heard us, but we also understand why she disagreed with us. But it was in a very respectful way. So by not shooting the messenger, by talking last, by listening to understand, and then summarizing why she wanted to go in a direction and take others' input into it, she created a safe environment for telling the truth. And I learned so much from that. And from then on, I always try to go to the junior person first. I always try to summarize why I disagreed with them so they felt heard, but they also understand why we're moving in a different direction. And I hope those points help your listeners, because creating an environment, a safe environment, is so important today, because people will, as they say, quiet quit, or they'll just leave if they don't feel listened to. So not only telling the truth to people, but creating an environment where truth can happen.
Well, and that's what we get to do as leaders. We have massive influence on the environment that is around us. And and somebody might be listening and say, look, I'm not the president of my company. Perhaps not, but the bubble around you is yours. The bubble around you as a leader, regardless of the organization you're in, and you can create that truthful environment if you're diligent to protect it in that way. And I love how practical these application points are. So,
I'm so glad you said that, Tim. And if you don't mind me kind of closing my thought with
yeah,
this, is we all know that love is the energy of life. It's one of the most important things out there. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why wouldn't we lead that way? And hopefully, after this podcast, your listeners are at least intrigued to think about leading with love, because now they do know that there is a better way out there. It's been proven to get results. And I'm just hoping that as people listen to this, they'll at least be motivated to check out the book if they're interested, or I'm online at joelmanby.com, and I do some blogging, and certainly they can reach out to me on Facebook, or LinkedIn's probably the best way to do it. And I just encourage them. They know a way that fits with everything you talk about and being who we are. I just hope people investigate being a more loving leader, because ultimately, Tim, it changes the world. Love changes relationships, and changed relationships will change the world.
As we wrap up today's episode, there's really just one idea that I want to zero in on. But before I do that, I just want to encourage everybody to pick up Joel's book, Love Works, and even to check out what he's writing at joelmanby.com. Whenever you get a chance to engage with somebody with such amazing experience and wonderful wisdom, I think it's smart for all of us to put that person on our radar so that we can learn from them, continue to hear from them on a regular basis. So big encouragement to pick up a copy of Joel's book, Love Works, and to follow him on LinkedIn, checking out his website, joelmanby.com as well. Okay. So with that, let me get into the one thing I want to zero in on following this conversation. And as I do a little debrief at the end of each of these episodes, this one's going to be a little bit different, because normally what I'm doing is there are 2 or 3 things that somebody has said that really got my attention for one reason or another, and we talk just a little bit more about them. But today is less about looking back at the interview to unpack a few things just a little bit more. It's more about looking forward. And there's a particular phrase that Joel used as he was talking about his early years of leadership, particularly at Saturn and Saab. And here was the phrase that he said. He said that he had an angst in his soul. That really landed with me. And I'm willing to bet there are some of you that are listening that you heard that and you connected with it. You related to it. You would say, you know what? I feel an angst in my soul when I look at the way that we lead in the organization, that you're in right now. I feel an angst. Or maybe you're even looking in the mirror and you're saying, the way I'm leading right now is not matching up with who I want to be. If that's you, this is a really important moment, because what Joel is inviting you and all of us to understand is that we don't have to make a choice between results and being who we were truly created to be. That's not a choice that we have to make. In fact, being a more fully developed human being somebody who's capable of loving while leading, is also being somebody who can achieve and produce exceptional results. It's not an either or equation. And so if you're feeling some of that angst that Joel talked about, I want to encourage you, you don't have to make a choice between results and being a truly well-developed human being. You can get to those simultaneously. But the very first thing that has to happen is that we first have to admit that that angst is there. And then second, we have to open ourselves up to being different. And so that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today. And that is this. When it comes to the organization you're leading in, and perhaps even to your leadership, do you feel an angst in your soul? If you do, there's something you can do about that. This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.